everyone, and welcome back to Black Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Carrie Ann Williams. I'm a psychiatrist practicing here in Massachusetts, and this is a show that's all about wellness in the Black community and beyond. Today, my show is going to be on children and grief. The past 2 years has been such a time of loss for everyone, including children, particularly because of the pandemic and for a lot of other reasons. For Black children in particular, they've had the added burden of seeing and hearing about deaths that are related to racism. And so they've had to process this more complex web of issues. I wanted to start off with just talking about what exactly is grief. Because grief itself can include a lot of things. Of course, the most apparent cause of grief is a loss of a person by death, especially if it's the death of a parent or of a sibling. But grief in children can include other kinds of losses. And, when it's the loss of the child's experience is not death, sometimes adults around them may not realize that they're grieving a particular loss. They may kind of undervalue the impact of the loss that the child may be going through. So children can grieve losses that are related to divorce, losses related to the family being together. They can also sometimes have to move from where they're living, so they grieve the loss of their previous home. They may change school districts, they may lose friends. And there's another kind of grief too that can be undervalued, and that is the kind of grief that occurs from losses due to medical conditions. In this case, children can sometimes miss out on important events due to medical appointments, hospitalizations, and sometimes their condition can lead to fatigue, or it can lead to limitations on their functioning in some way, so they may grieve the losses related to those limitations. With the COVID pandemic, children have had to switch to remote schooling, particularly back in 2020. They had to switch to remote schooling, and then once they returned to school, there were restrictions in place that kind of made their school experience different from what maybe they had been hoping it might be. And for many youth, they may have missed out on things like the prom, in 2020, or a typical traditional graduation ceremony. And there's a lot of other different kinds of things that we call them rites of passage that young people look forward to that have either been canceled or altered in some way, and so they've missed out on it, and they may be grieving the loss of that. And these losses can add up and cumulatively lead to grieving in children and youth. Now, today's show, I'm going to primarily talk about grief for when a person has passed away, when the child loses an important person who's passed away. According to some sources, Black children in the US experience a relatively higher rate of losing someone to death. They have a higher rate of losing mothers, losing fathers, and losing siblings. And this is, of course, due to a complex kind of systemic factors, because there's a lot of things that lead to the death of Black people in the US, including a shortened life expectancy. And so, in this way, Black children as a group have had to spend more time finding ways to cope with death and losses on a more frequent basis, at least by some reports. So what are some signs that your child is grieving? This may seem intuitive, if someone has just passed away, then you can see, well, clearly they're grieving, someone just passed away. But the reason I bring up the question, how can you tell if your child is grieving, is because sometimes children express their grief differently from adults. So I want to make sure to point some of those things out. But then also because, as I mentioned, just now, death is not the only thing that leads to grieving. Your child may be grieving other losses, and so it may be helpful to recognize when they're grieving losses in general. So of course the most obvious sign of grieving is sadness. Young children can also become very clingy, kind of reaching out for support. And one of the things that parents may not necessarily be prepared for with young children is that young children can experience regression. And regression is basically when a child starts to behave in ways that are younger than would be expected for their age. And sometimes they seem to lose skills that they had already learned. So for example, a child who is potty trained may suddenly start wetting themselves again. Or a child might start talking in a baby voice. Or maybe a child who was able to sleep in their own room, now they're climbing into bed to sleep in your room and in your bed. And regression is generally a sign of stress. It's a sign that the child is overwhelmed and they're not sure how to cope, and they're trying to communicate that through their behavior. So it's not done intentionally. It is a kind of a psychological process that children go through when they are very, very emotionally overwhelmed, that they may regress. And so they need support and not, criticism or discipline. You may also see an increase in anxiety. Of course, that could lead to them wanting to not sleep by themselves. But children hold a lot of anxiety because especially small children, because they may not understand fully what's going on. And so they may need support with that. So you may see anxiety as a sign of the grief and loss. The other thing that parents may not expect, but sometimes happens with young children when they're grieving, is that they may have an increase in silly behavior, believe it or not. And that silliness, which can be so kind of annoying to adults around them, may actually be a sign of anxiety and overwhelming emotions. That they just don't know what to do with all these emotions, and it comes out as silliness. The other kind of concept that I wanted to just talk about with small children and grief, small children developmentally, they tend to see the world in terms of themselves. They don't have the ability to take a broad perspective. Their brain just doesn't work that way. It's very concrete. And so small children have a difficult time seeing an external point of view. When things around them happen, they tend to feel that they have a role in it because they can only see things from their point of view, from their perspective. So when someone passes away, it's not uncommon for children to feel like they had some kind of role in it, that is somehow related to them. And this can come out as children believing that they caused it to happen. Young children engage in something called magical thinking. And in magical thinking, children can connect things together as a cause and effect, even though those things don't actually logically go together. So, for example, they may feel like because they didn't brush their teeth when they were told to, or they didn't pick up their shoes when they were told to, that they caused something bad to happen. And so as a parent, you may need to check for that to make sure that they're not having any kind of incorrect beliefs like that, and that they're not believing that they caused someone to die, because that could be leading to some anxiety and some of their sadness as well, and it's totally incorrect. Now, just like adults, sometimes children and youth, when they express grief, they kind of respond to their losses with anger. They can feel angry about what happened, and you may see young children playing with their toys more aggressively, kind of hitting things harder. That could be a sign that they're, expressing some anger, and that's just a reaction to that feeling of loss. They just feel upset about it. And sometimes that anger that children and young people can experience, it may just be connected to the sadness. Sadness and anger tend to be connected, and sometimes the anger is at themselves. Maybe there's some regret that they had. So for example, as I mentioned, young children may think that they were the cause. Older, they have a better understanding of logic. They know how death works. They may know that they're not necessarily the cause, but they may have some other kind of regret, especially if, they may have a situation where maybe their last conversation with the person had a negative kind of experience to it. They may regret that the last conversation was negative. They may wish that they could have said something differently or done something differently. So they may be angry at themselves for that, and they may be holding on to that. They just didn't get to repair or resolve the situation. Sometimes the young person, the teenager, may be angry at God. How could God allow this to happen? And in some cases, young people may do risky things. They may start using drugs to cope. They may run away from home because they're just completely overwhelmed by the situation or overwhelmed by their emotions. So there's a lot of different ways that children and young people can respond to feelings of grief. When youth are at school or with their peers, sometimes they feel different, they feel distant, they feel like no one understands what they've been through. They feel like they're not the same person anymore, and they can't really interact with their peers in the same way that they used to. And they may have difficulty focusing in school. So then how do you talk to children about grief? Because young children often have a lot of questions. And a lot of times parents have this question about, how do I talk to my child about grief and about death? Well, very young children, maybe under age 7 or younger, they tend to believe that death is temporary because they don't understand the permanency of death. And so they may ask about when the person is returning. And also, little children have a tendency to address grief in short bursts. So they may be playing and laughing, and then they suddenly run up to you and ask you like a serious question about grief or about the person or about death. And then you answer the question, and they acknowledge that you answered it, and then they run back and then continue playing and laughing again. And they just have these like bursts of times where they'll bring it up or talk about it. School-age children, as I mentioned, they tend to understand the finality of death. They know that the person is not coming back. But because they understand that death is permanent, they start to kind of understand that death can happen to anyone, they may start to worry about the other parent. Am I going to lose the other parent? Am I going to lose my other sibling? And they begin to kind of develop anxiety around that. And so parents may need to address the anxiety they have about the fact that death is something that happens, and it could happen to anyone, but it's not necessarily something that's imminent for all people at all times. So that may be something to address. Also, school-age children may have practical questions. If let's say a parent passed away and that was a parent that packed their lunch, they may have questions about, well, who's going to pack my lunch now? Or if that's a parent that drove them to school, they may have questions, well, who's going to drive me to school now? So you may need to even just sit and answer some of those very practical questions that they may have. The other thing is just the idea of, how do you tell children that someone has died, right? Well, when we talk to children, the experts would suggest, they would recommend that you should always be honest. Don't ever lie about how a person died. Always be honest, but try to simplify the vocabulary and the concepts to match the child's age. Okay, just simplify those concepts. And then as they get older, you can explain more about those concepts as their knowledge base grows and their understanding grows. You can explain more. Also, the experts would recommend that you should avoid confusing statements. So don't say things like, the person went to sleep. Because if you describe death as sleep, the child may then be anxious about going to sleep. Because now they don't really understand that the word sleep can be used multiple ways. Because remember, small children are very concrete. They can't think abstractly. So if you tell them the person went to sleep, they only understand sleep one way. So they're going to develop anxiety about sleep potentially. The other thing is young children may not understand the phrase passed away. Because again, the word passed away is an abstract concept. So you may want to just be concrete with very young children and just use the word died. The person died. And then you explain, what does died mean, right? So use a concrete phrase and then explain what the phrase means. So you can say, well, what is death? Death means that the person's body has stopped working. and that the person can no longer breathe or talk or move or eat. Just a very kind of simple definition. Death means the person's body has stopped working, that the person can no longer breathe, talk, move, or eat. And also, guys, sometimes there are books and videos that you can use with your children. I tried Googling, resources and books for children who are grieving, and there were so many books out there on the internet that I didn't even know where to begin. And so I'm going to see if I can try to have, an expert come on the show at a later date and maybe give some of their top recommendations for where to start with books to use with children to explain and talk about the concept of death. Now, teenagers, of course, understand what death is. They're able to think more abstractly, so they don't necessarily need the explanation of, what is death. In fact, they sometimes like to process their emotions with their peers and not so much with their parents. And so sometimes parents may feel confused about why their teenager isn't talking to them about it. They may feel like their children should be coming to them, but teenagers do tend to talk to their friends about certain things. But as I mentioned also earlier, on the flip side, sometimes teens begin to feel distant and different from their peers, and they may isolate, and they just feel like no one can understand them, and they kind of start to feel alone. So that's something that maybe parents need to make sure to address with their teens as well. The other thing that experts would recommend is to talk with your children about your family's beliefs about death. So if you have particular spiritual beliefs about life after death, to talk to your children about those things. So practical things that can be done to help children. Here are a few tips from the experts. One is to let them attend the funeral and join the family in saying goodbye to the person. However, if a child is feeling frightened or uncomfortable, they should not be forced to go. There may actually even be ways for them to say attend portions of the funeral if there are certain aspects that they can tolerate and other aspects that they can't tolerate. You may be able to kind of select that and enlist family members to help out with providing emotional support throughout the funeral, especially if at the time you're feeling very affected emotionally and you're not able to be emotionally available for them, or if you're super busy and maybe you're involved in some of the funeral arrangements and planning, and you're again kind of somehow maybe not physically available to comfort the child. Try to get family members or close friends to help out with that. The second thing is to try to maintain the child's routines as much as possible. Whereas, the adult schedule may be kind of a bit off kilter because maybe, again, you're helping with funeral arrangements, you're doing this, you're doing that. The child's routines, as best as possible, should be the same. So if they usually take their nap at that particular time, try to keep the nap time the same, try to keep the bedtime the same, try to keep their meal times the same. In whatever way that you can try to maintain their routine, try to maintain their routine, even if yours is a bit disrupted. And again, this is where having a family member can help, because maybe they can help you to keep those routines going for your child even when you're not available. So the third thing is to provide validation. Sometimes adults don't realize that they tell children things like, don't cry, or other kind of similar phrases, which can sometimes serve to kind of communicate that they shouldn't express emotions. And it's not really fair, because sometimes without even realizing it, we're telling children to kind of stop showing their emotions because it makes us feel sad, it makes us feel uncomfortable as adults. And the truth is that children need to hear that what they're feeling and what they're experiencing is expected given the circumstances, and we should let them know that their feelings are welcome. That's really, really important. And children often ask repeated questions, so you may have to patiently re-answer the questions each time because they're processing and they're trying to figure out what's going on. And again, the younger the child, the more confused they may be about what's going on. The fourth thing is that children may need a separate space to talk about their emotions and experiences, particularly after a lot of the main things have finished, after the funeral is finished, after people that maybe have been visiting in town, they've already left, and the child is going back to school. They have this part of their life that seems like it's going on as normal, like school and so on, but then they still hold this memory of the person, and they need a space to talk about those feelings and those experiences and those memories. So sometimes that can occur in a bereavement group, which in different cities and states, there are bereavement groups in different areas. You can, again, check the internet for your area to see what might be available. But in bereavement groups, children or young adults or adolescents, they kind of meet with others their age that have had similar experiences. And this can be really helpful because it can help them to feel less isolated, particularly if they feel like their friends at school just can't possibly understand what they're going through. Going to a bereavement group may help them to be around other people that may be able to better understand what they might be going through. Sometimes children and adolescents may need to meet with a professional, even if it's temporary, for individual therapy as well, and to just have that space to talk and process. The fifth thing is sometimes you may need school accommodations. Again, maybe just temporarily. They may need to reduce their workload. They may need to take more breaks, soon after a loss. And sometimes children go back to school and their classroom teacher doesn't even know what happened. They may not know that they just went through a loss. And that's important because, let's say, particularly in the Black community, as I mentioned earlier, in the Black community, children may encounter more losses on a whole and more frequently. The teacher may or may not know that the child has experienced some kind of loss, and so they may not recognize the behavioral signs of grief, and they may think the child is just willfully not paying attention when the child may be suffering from grief, or they may think the child is just willfully being irritated or irritable, and again, the irritability may be coming from a place of sadness and grief. So it's important to have some communication with the school and maybe some talk of accommodations, even if it's temporary. The sixth thing is helping your child find their new normal. You want to help them to memorialize the person who was lost and be able to kind of move forward with their daily routine, including the memory of that person. So again, always be sensitive to the fact that everybody grieves differently. Some people cope by trying to put the person out of their mind. Others might want to keep the memory alive and want to keep talking about the person. So just find out what your child needs and help them to find a way to memorialize the person who was lost. It's a good thing to kind of teach children how to deal with. And here are some tips, some other tips that therapists use. I want to share with you some of the things that therapists might do with kids. So one of the things that therapists do is what we call reframing, where there might be thoughts that a person is having, and we can take those thoughts and we can share an alternate perspective on the same thing to help you to learn how to think about it differently. It's all about perspective taking. So it's when we do reframing, we're offering a different interpretation of the same situation. An example of a simple reframe that we use in the Christian church is, now the person that you lost is in heaven and they're happy. There's no more sadness and no more pain for them. And that is one way of kind of saying, okay, let's take this perspective of this situation. That can be helpful for children. The second thing is what we call a coping toolbox. Coping toolbox is, something like a small shoebox, and you put items in there that the child may find comforting. So the child kind of has an active role in choosing the items that go into this coping box. And they choose items that they find comforting or that they can use to help themselves feel better. So then whenever they feel sad or whenever they feel upset, they can go to that coping toolbox and they can use the items in the box to help themselves feel better. The third thing is a memory box. And so the memory box, as you might imagine, is where we put items that we can kind of remind us of happy times with a person that we lost. So we put these certain items in the box and they help to bring back happy memories of that person. And that can be helpful for the child too, is that that person, even though they've died, they're not forgotten, and we still hold those memories inside of us, even if the person isn't here. The fourth thing, and this is plus or minus, but sometimes for some people, particularly if there is something that's that was unresolved or unsaid, they may engage in an exercise where they theoretically kind of write a letter. So they do this thing where they write a letter to the person who's passed away. And the exercise is that they'll say, well, if you could write a letter to the person who passed away, what would you write? And so that's something that, in particular, like a young adult or adolescent could do, especially if they're in that situation where the last conversation they had with a person before they died was a negative conversation and they wish it could have gone differently. It can sometimes be kind of very therapeutic to go through a process of writing out what you wished you could have said to the person, and kind of being able to let go of those thoughts and feelings. Then the fifth one, not going to come as a surprise to you, that is expressing yourself through the arts. And so this is where we ask the child or the adolescent to put their feelings into art. So maybe they're drawing something, painting, sculpting. Some people are good at poetry or music. They can put their thoughts and feelings into art and music. Basically, whatever they're thinking and feeling, because these things can be so difficult to describe. I mean, how do you describe your grief process to someone? It's so difficult to talk about sometimes. But art and music can be a way to express things that are difficult to say in words. So as I kind of come to a close with this kind of briefer show on grief, I want to just mention that grief does not disappear. It's not something for someone to get over. It's something that people find a way to live with and to live through. The loss is something that people adjust to. And so many people are able to do this without the help of a professional, and then others really benefit from meeting with a professional for support. The last thing that I want to mention is just this idea of what we call traumatic grief. Sometimes the grief that a child experiences is traumatic grief. And according to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, a child who's suffering from traumatic grief may have intrusive thoughts and intrusive memories about the death. And that could include nightmares. And I've spoken about in previous shows what trauma is, and in trauma you can have nightmares, you can have flashbacks. There's all these different thoughts, emotions, feelings, behaviors, and things you experience. And if you combine that with grief, you end up with traumatic grief. And so children that are experiencing this kind of prolonged and traumatic grief may end up withdrawing. They may end up avoiding memories of the person, even happy memories. Even when you're talking about, positive things and you're having happy memories, the child may not even be able to tolerate the happy memories. That's one of the signs that you know it's traumatic grief. They may have persistent irritability. They may start to have a decline in their school performance that's more prolonged. They may have physical symptoms, headaches or stomach aches that, again, they're just not going away. In the Black community, the circumstances of our losses are sometimes related to racism and racial disparities, as I had mentioned kind of earlier in the show. So, for example, someone might be killed as a result of racial bias, or they may suffer from a health condition that leads to an untimely death due to disparities in health care. And due to the history of systemic racism in this country, the Black community tends to experience a complex web of losses. So it includes, people who pass away like physically, but there's also losses that are social and cultural losses in our community. And we grieve those losses as well. And so that's happened historically and continue to happen to this day. There's losses through community violence, there's losses through incarceration. And then the losses are compounded by the stress of inequity and poverty and other hardships. And so, as I mentioned before, there is data to prove that there are relatively more deaths to process in the Black community. And children are losing parents at a higher rate, they're losing their siblings, parents are losing their children. And so by default, that would put us in a place where we're also more likely to face traumatic grief. Our children may have behavioral problems at school because of traumatic grief. They may have trouble focusing, they may have trouble reaching their full academic potential because of grief. We grieve as a community. These losses belong to all of us. And so in the Black community, our grief can connect us in this kind of collective experience. So what are your thoughts about grief in the Black community? What do you do to help support your children, our children in the community? Some of the strategies that I mentioned earlier for practical activities to do with children can be helpful. There may be other resources like the books, which I said you can kind of look some of them up on the internet. I'll try to see what I can do to provide some resources at a later date. And let me know what your recommendations are. Drop a comment below and let me know what your thoughts are. And that is all I have for today with Black Mental Health Matters. It's kind of a quick show on grief and children, and we'll revisit this topic again in the future. So take care. Thank you for joining me this week, and I will see you next time.